whoops. And this month's program is going to be really great. Dan's a really big cyclist, and he is so impressed by Suzette, and he's been so excited for her to come this whole time. He's been like, Una, this program is going to be the best. Like, it's going to be so good. Like, oh, we have to get everybody to come to September. And she's going to share an incredible cycling adventure that she and a few friends undertook a few years ago. And she will tell us all the rest, and I'm sure it's going to be amazing. So please welcome Suzette.
Hi everyone, my name is Suzette, and today I'm going to talk to you about the bike ride that I did from Alaska to Florida in memory of my brother. I hope to tell you a bit about how I did it, some of the people that I met along the way, and why I think you also should go on a bike tour. So my brother Patrick and I were best friends. We used to visit each other every semester of college, and we'd play frisbee, we'd beatbox, we would, to please our worrying mother, also grocery shop. And anyone who knew my brother can attest that he was obsessed with deals. And so when we walked into the grocery store and saw that there was buy one, get one free gallons of milk, my brother was stoked. He said we had to buy 4. Like, that is too many. We need to stick to one as planned. And he was like, there's nothing better than a BOGO deal, and did this little like BOGO dance. And so made me carry 2 of the gallons back. When we got to his dorm, we realized there's already a half gallon of milk sitting in that mini fridge. And the fridge could only hold 4. So I declared a victory, but he looked me straight in the eye. And he said, good thing we have a half gallon of milk, because I am thirsty for a half gallon of milk right now. And he sat and he drank a half gallon of milk. And I want to tell you this so you have a little bit of a sense of who my brother was. I want to tell you about the Beanie Baby slingshot we made that could fling Beanie Babies an entire city block. And I want to tell you about the road trips that we went on where we listened to every single Dashboard confessional album. And I want to tell you about how he always thought you were smart enough to believe something. And I want to tell you about how he used to drink way too much AeroPress coffee so that he could grade all the students' papers and then go play bass with his band. And I want to tell you about the students that he taught and how when they would get into college, he celebrated like it was the best day of his life. And I want to tell you this so you can understand what the world lost with his death. My brother was hit and killed by a cell phone distracted driver on a cross-country bike trip. And I just want you to know how alive he was and how alive he made you feel. So that when I tell you that I biked 8,000 miles from Alaska to Florida, you'd understand that that's exactly what he would have done. It was sort of something I felt capable of. I needed a way to channel my grief, to feel forward motion. I always loved riding my bike and I had a sense of adventure. But I camped a handful of times. I'd only recently learned to fix the flat, and I was a thin-skinned Miamian who didn't see snow until I was 16 when I went to Vermont to see an unrequited love. So I recruited some friends in the cycling community who knew a little bit more about distance cycling than I did, and recruited my brother's girlfriend who knew less about distance cycling than I did, but had a whole lot of spirit. So it felt enormous and scary and uncomfortable. My brother always said, if you're not uncomfortable, you're not growing. So my brother and I's last ever century ride was down to Key West. So I decided I had to go to the northernmost point. This is the route of what we rode. So there are 2 big reasons why we chose this route in particular. So I will now engage some audience participation and ask, do you have any idea why, what are some reasons, the 2 big ones that we chose this route?
It's kind of flat.
Oh, no, it wasn't. Nice try. Any other guesses?
As far as you could go in the United States from the beginning to the end.
Not quite, but I'd be curious if it was. Good guess.
been a seasonal thing where the weather would change as we're moving through?
Exactly. So we started up in Alaska in the middle of the summer, which meant that we had to be in the continental US by the winter, and crossing the Rockies in snowfall wouldn't be possible. Here's the weather. It was still extremely cold. It even snowed in August in Alaska, and we kind of kept this seasonal chill going. And also there's this awesome organization called the Adventure Cycling Association, which, oh, you're nodding, they're great. They make really scenic and safe routes across the US. And so we decided to follow the Pacific coast and then southern tier. And it also really felt like 3 distinct trips: the Great North, the Pacific coast, and then across the country. And I'll sort of speak about them as such. So exactly 1 year and 1 day after my brother died, we ended up in Dead Horse, Alaska. It is on the Arctic Ocean coast. The sun doesn't set. It's really barren. The road, the Dalton Highway, which is a 500-mile stretch between Dead Horse and Fairbanks, has no permanent population. There's a gas station around the halfway mark and a welcome center for the Arctic Circle National Park. But aside from that, there really is nothing. When I think back on it now, it feels like a dream. And so I looked back and actually found a letter that I wrote to one of my best friends to describe this time. This is to my friend Joya, who was critical in really supporting me and keeping me alive through my most intense parts of my grief process. And so I wrote this letter to her, of which I will read a small section of now. Dear Joya, today I woke up and I realized that I'm the farthest that I have ever been from home. Physically, possibly, I'm thousands of miles away. But emotionally, friend, I am so far away. I woke up in a cabin of 1 room and no water and no electricity to the sound of 30 sled dogs barking. I unzipped my sleeping bag in the woods to pee, and I remember you rode peeing in the Badlands on our road trip. And I realized the dogs might freak out, so instead knocked on the door of the sled dog musher we were staying with to use his bathroom. And then he took me on a sled dog ride. A sled dog ride. And each day, something so far from the ordinary seems to happen. Eating moose meat and filtering water from streams, or meeting touring cyclists who have been riding for years. Some days it feels a little overwhelming to feel at the edge of the earth, so far away from home. But others, it feels exciting, invigorating. It reminds me of how much there is still left to discover in this life. And I'm forever grateful for you, because without you, I could never live to discover these moments. Some days, it's so quiet that my ears ring. I ride a few miles ahead, no traffic passes for hours. Up in Alaska, I was too far north for trees to grow, so you couldn't even hear a rustle of leaves. When you wrote to me asking to bottle up a little bit of wonder, the silence is the first thing I thought of. After you read this, close your eyes and listen to every sound you can possibly hear. The traffic, the voices outside, the breeze hitting the curtains, footsteps, breathing, mosquitoes, the refrigerator humming, clocks ticking, paper rustling, everything. And one by one, try to imagine each of them silencing. Yes, even the sound of people chewing, which I know you hate. And in that moment, imagine being up here with me in Alaska. Imagine how vast it is, how wondrous. Imagine being as far as you've ever been from home. And imagine it's okay to be far. As long as you know the love of your friends and your family will always cross that distance. Love always. Is that? There aren't that many people that far north, but the ones that do live there are exceptionally interesting. I remember a construction worker who had moved all the way north after her daughter died. She said that she would see her daughter's spirit in the butterflies. I remember Hugh, the eccentric sled dog musser. I remember Dave, the unusual man who lived on the Alaska-Yukon border, who brewed wine in his bathtub and insisted on guarding our tent with a shotgun for coyotes. I remember this woman who fed us salmon she'd caught and blueberries she'd picked, and what I swear was the most delicious meal of my life. And I remember this one fisherman from the Gatanyao tribe. He met us a few days' ride north and invited us to his home when we finally crossed in. When we got there, I remember it felt unusually empty. And I remember he had really nice shampoo and conditioner. And after a long night of like laughing and chatting, we thanked him profusely, but he thanked us. He said this was the first night that he'd spent because his wife and his daughters had left the day before. And he was so grateful to have us to make things not feel so empty. You get to know people really intimately, really quickly when you're bike touring. Part of it is that you're in places that very, very rarely get visitors, and so they're eager to share their stories. But also when you're going on a bike trip, you're really showing a ton of trust in the world, and a lot of vulnerability, and people respond to that in a really incredible way. It's also funny how your reference point changes. So in the first 2,500 miles, the one city that we went to was Whitehorse up in the Yukon Territory. The population is 27,000, which is like the number of people outside Zingerman's on game day. And I remember it felt like a metropolis. Most of the time, we camped. Here's a particularly nice campsite that had a table, and we were so thrilled about the table. We took a picture. You get really in touch with your body. You ride until you don't want to anymore, and then you start looking out for a campsite. It's basically all public land that far north. So as long as you're leaving no trace, you're pretty good to go. And the four of us all had sort of separate tasks. Like one person would set up the tent, one person would set up the stove, one person would collect all the like sunscreen and chapsticks, I think that smelled, to put in a bear canister to put as far away from the tent as possible. The four of us slept in one tent, and let me tell you how well you get to know three adults and you live in a tent with them, especially when you're not showering. We'd make rice and beans, we'd lick our bowls clean, we'd inflate our sleeping pads, we'd go into our tents, we'd read or we'd write letters, and we'd go to sleep. It was a really simple existence, and after a year of grief that was so complicated, I was so grateful for something that was so straightforward. So now, since y'all are the Sierra Club, I was told to add some like fun animal facts. What are some types of bears you think we encountered? There are three types. Think of a bear, any bear. Whoa, Sierra Club loves the bears. Not all at once, but more bears. Grizzly. Nice. Yes.
Black bear.
Oh my gosh. Great job, Spot. So grizzly bears are a type of brown bear. We had brown bears, black bears, and polar bears. Fortunately, brown and black were the only ones that we encountered in person. Polar bears, if you do see them up in Alaska, are usually very angry because of climate change, which makes sense. And they tend to be quite aggressive. Fortunately, we didn't have any encounters with bears when we were sleeping because we were super, super diligent about putting things in bear canisters. Some people will do bear hangs, like putting their stuff in a bag and hanging them, but because we were so far north, there were no trees. We couldn't necessarily count on the bear hang. But we did once encounter a mama grizzly and her cubs when we were riding, and we were like, well, this is not ideal. What will we do? So we waited like an hour, and then a car showed up and waved them down. We asked if we could ride really slowly behind them. They were a little confused by the request, but I think ultimately everything made sense and worked out quite well. We have another little quiz question for you all. Oh, that's a little bear canister, and that is Rachel, who is her brother's girlfriend. How many states do you think we crossed? There were two provinces, the Yukon, which is a territory, and then BC, which is a province. But looking at this map, how many states?
13.
27, 13, 12, 7.
12.
9. 10. Very close. I thank you all for believing in me. 27. Jesus. We spent around 1,000 miles each in Alaska, Texas, California, and Florida. Some of them, like Mississippi and Alabama, were only in for a day each. And then a lot of the distance came from being in the Yukon and in British Columbia. We also did a lot of jaunts into Mexico. We never actually crossed it, but because we followed the border for so long, it could be nice to just walk in for the evening and get a taco. It was lovely. So then we entered our next phase, which is down to the Pacific coast. Highway 1 is really famous for its beauty and also for being an adventure cycling association route. So you have a ton of people doing it and a ton of really different people doing it. It was so social. We would ride, chat with people in the day, kind of share the same campsites. I remember these American nurses who were travel nurses who would bike tour in between their different shifts. And I remember this older Japanese man who'd been riding for over a decade with a walk strapped to the back of his bike. And this eccentric French-Canadian drifter who just left Quebec one day and kept riding and like acquired things as he went. He's this 21-year-old Alaskan firefighter who had a super ultralight setup who would bike tour in wet season. This person, Leaf in the Wind, who would perform on a pan flute to raise money for his trip as he went. There were 3 Australian women who we spent a ton of time with who were convinced they had to get to Mexico to have the best shot of tequila of their lives. And that was their motivating factor. And then, ironically, a former contestant on Survivor. And so anyone can bike tour. But one thing I do want to address is that you can too. Like, you don't need a lot of money. You can just take whatever bike you have. You just need a bit of a sense of adventure and a willingness to take things as they come. Oftentimes people ask me, what do you take on a bike tour? And I can show you literally everything I took on a bike tour. Wrong way, wrong way. This is every single thing I took on my bike tour. I drew this, but one very lonely, boring night in the tent. I'm not an artist, but everything you own on a bike tour is so precious to you because you only have these like few things. So I have my bike, which is named Dave after the eccentric man who brewed wine in his bathtub and protected us from the coyotes. It was a fairly long haul to have a bike I had, but again, your bike is fine. My beer canister, my panniers, my saddle, which I later replaced with a leather saddle, which I very much recommend. A silly self-portrait with me and my little helmet mirror. I love a helmet mirror and also recommend that. I had a backpack with a safety triangle and 3 liters of water in it. We have stopped to filter water throughout the day. And then inside my panniers, I have every article of clothing that I carried with me. One thing that you don't think about, but is very pressing, is you are constantly doing laundry on a bike tour. You don't have that many things. And so whenever you get to a place, you'll wash the thing you wore that day and strap it to your bike and hope that it doesn't rain the next day so it can properly dry. A torn up copy of The Fountainhead. Okay, I'm not an Ayn Rand person. However, I could bring one book and you needed a book with a high word per weight ratio, which is not how I recommend choosing literature. But I had that. I had a trowel for poops. I had a menstrual cup. I had a toothbrush. Here's my other pannier. An envelope where we kept letters and a journal, and then a beer canister full of a lot of very calorie dense foods. You're eating a lot when you're bike touring. You're like putting down like 3,000 or 4,000 calories a day. But then the more you carry, the heavier it is, the more calories you need. So it's a bit of this balance of understanding how much you can like afford to eat in a day because you want to be able to get to the next supply stop and having not run out of food. So I also wanted to talk a little bit about like the forward motion of grief. So here was me at mile 2,117 of my bike trip. You wouldn't recognize this number, but I will never forget it because my brother was killed at mile 2,117 because. So when we hit this marker, we stopped and we paused. Grief is so non-linear, right? Some days are normal bad. Some days are so bad you can only leave that to vomit. Some days are good. And then some days you feel guilty about feeling so good. And then you're just back in this roller coaster of awfulness. But what's so satisfying about bike touring is every day you move forward. You can look at a map and you can see that you were 60 miles further from when you woke up that morning, or maybe 100 miles further, or maybe 20 miles further. That's okay. But as the days and the weeks and the months pass, you can look at where you started from where you're going and think, I'm moving forward and I'm going to be okay. So our last third of the trip was just across the country. I remember the desert was so cold and bright. There's also not a lot of people there. We'd sing songs in the day. We'd trudge through the sand to set up our tent. But it did have a very particular dread to me because we were going to pass through Austin, Texas, which is where I was the day my brother was killed. And I wrote a blog post from that time that I want to read to you now. I got a postcard from Patrick. He mailed it from his biking build route in Ohio to my summer sublet in Austin, but I rushed out before its arrival. The front displayed a colorful map of Pennsylvania. Kiddo is written in bulky block letters. His distinctively messy handwriting, one that I'm now remembering was so similar to mine, covers the back with descriptions of day-to-day life happenings. It arrived after he died. Only now, after 6,500 miles and returning to Austin, did I get to read his words. I could have read it months ago. The friend safekeeping it for me could have simply mailed it to my new residence. But it felt too heavy, too painfully significant to receive so simply. This was it. This was Patrick's final message to me. Coming to terms with the reality that everything Patrick would ever say or do has already happened is unbearably difficult. While my life progresses, his remains stagnant, finalized. I figured as long as I left this postcard in red, I left one final stone unturned. Some new discovery could emerge from this 4x6 piece of cardstock. Once it was finally delivered to me, thanks to some very diligent friends and friends of friends, I wanted to hand it back. I wanted to cry. I wanted to say I wasn't ready. I wanted to keep it suspended in a Schrodinger's paradox to allow Patrick to always have something unfinished to say to me. But as I stared at the front photo and held it in my shaking hands, I knew I simply had to read it. It carried no untold secrets, no grand confessionals, no life-changing insights. My eyes welled with tears. This was it. Patrick, why couldn't you have given me more? Why couldn't you have comforted me about your impending death or given me advice in the next half century without you or told me a final dying wish? My chest constricted. I'd instilled so much faith in this postcard for the past year and a half, hoping it would be the one time Patrick could speak to me about his death, because after all, he was speaking to me after death. But his lighthearted recap of bicycling through Ohio afforded no such insight. As I held the postcard for longer and ran my fingers around his handwriting, my devastation dissolved into relief. There was no extraordinary reveal because Patrick did not know I would be sitting alone, sobbing and reading it over a year later. He did not know the significance it would hold. He simply did not know he was going to die. That thought brings me comfort. He wrote about bicycling terrain and delicious dinners because for that beautiful last month of his life, that was all that mattered. He wouldn't have imagined needing to convey dying wishes. To him, death did not loom ahead. Life did. And perhaps that's indeed what he would have wanted to communicate to me from the grave. That in life, he always focused on living. And that in my life, perhaps I should do the same. I inhaled deeply. I slid the postcard gently into my bag. I got back on my bike. And then the swamps. The Spanish moss grew heavy, but our bags were lighter from no longer having to carry days' worth of food and water. I remember we ate crawdads from plastic bags we'd buy from the pound and listened to really good street musicians in New Orleans. We biked through his college town of Gainesville. We swatted mosquitoes in the Everglades. And then in the most surreal way possible, I biked home. This is me and my parents, a few 175 miles worth of our finish. Again, we weren't done yet, but I remember my dad met up with us on his bike commute back from work. And we passed the elementary school that we used to sneak, my brother and I used to sneak onto in late summer nights with our friends, and that beach we used to play Frisbee in, and that parking lot that we found that one injured bird that we couldn't save. And after over 7 months on the road, sleeping in the home that I grew up with my parents and my brother in, felt surreal. I do remember there's this one particular 5K route that I used to run through the neighborhood, and I decided I was going to go for a run. And I got about a block and a half before I just couldn't do it. And I thought I was like, oh, I'm in the best shape of my life, but I put on like 15 pounds of muscle, none of which were useful for running, and had to simply walk home. And the last stretch to Key West, we invited anyone who wanted to come to join us. We had a big and celebratory group rolling back. Many of the people who are on the Zoom were with us, in fact. So hello, everyone. It was sunny and there was tailwind. And when we pulled up to the beach, the southernmost point, we dropped our bikes and we ran into the water. And it was exactly where I'd been with my brother just over 2 years prior. And it was the perfect end to a wild adventure. So I have one more quiz question for you all. So 8,000 miles in the distance that we rode. Does anyone know what percent of the circumference of the globe that is?
33%.
Jesus! It is a third of the globe. And it feels really amazing to think about the world and how big and beautiful and interesting and exciting it is to feel that my legs took me across a third of it and yours can too. So my final thing to you is, what do you need to go on a bike tour? A bike, yours is fine. When you start throwing money into your bike, you'll get something that's a little more durable, has a few more eyelets. But again, don't let this be the thing that holds you back. You need some free time. This is something I had the luxury of because I just finished college and was long before Ann Arbor was a twinkle in my eye and didn't have a job yet. So it was the perfect time to do it. But if you have a weekend, go for a weekend. You'll meet someone cool. You'll do something wonderful. You'll enjoy it a lot. You need a tolerance of eating lots of peanut butter. Calorie density is key, and you eat kind of the same things again and again. And you need a sense of adventure. No matter how your trip is planned and how detail-oriented you are, something is going to go radically differently than you expect. You just gotta roll with it. Or you'll see an opportunity to do something cool. We did a very major reroute in the middle of our ride because we had heard that it was more scenic and that it was a lot safer, and so we did. And you can just go with that. Well, you don't need much money. So the trip cost me, I did fundraise for this trip, but it was about $2,000 for the 8 months, which like $2,000 is not a sum of money like everyone can throw around. But for an 8-month-long adventure of my life, it really isn't that insane. Oftentimes you're staying with people through this wonderful site called Warm Showers, which I recommend, or through friends of friends. You just meet people on the road. You look very distinctively despite. People are curious and they'll invite you to just camp in their backyard, and soon enough you're like holding their baby and like separating food with them. Like, it's wonderful. So that, and they'll let you do laundry very frequently. So it's a lot cheaper than a lot of people think it is. You don't need much of a plan. ACA routes are a great place to start. We had a pretty strong idea that we wanted to start very far north and very far south and generally mapped it out, but you don't necessarily need to. You don't need the end of your toothbrush. I'm being a little cheeky here, but when you're on a bike tour, you physically carry every single thing you use. And so you have to start thinking very critically about how much things weigh and how useful they are. So like a toothbrush, you don't actually need the end of, right? You can hold it here and it still works. And that seems insane. But when you apply that same logic to every single thing you own, all of a sudden your ride's a little lighter and you feel a little freer. And then the last thing I want to say is anyone's approval. I needed to do this bike trip for me and for my grief process and to feel close to my brother and to feel free. Understandably, I had a lot of people not excited about this idea, who very much discouraged me against it. My brother was killed on a bike trip, but I can understand that why that is a hard thing to reconcile. But bike touring is statistically quite safe. And there's this quote that I love that I will end on, and it is, "Of course the ship is safest at port, but that is not what ships are." Thank you all so much. And I'm happy to field any questions, or if they're pinging, you can read them out. Yeah. Hi, what's your name?
Linda,
Hey, Linda, I'm Suzette.
I rode across the desert. I was on a support ride. I've ridden all 50 states,
Amazing.
but I was on a supported ride. And because there was no place to stay and no place to get food and water, we rode 2 very long days, 116 and 122. How did you have food and water going across the desert? They brought it to us in a van.
Water is the main thing. So up north, right, we would go over a week between restocking food, but there was always water to filter, so it was more feasible. In the desert, we would just we'd calculate how much water we thought we would drink. It also helped we were biking through the desert in December. So you don't sweat nearly as much as you are in the summer, and you can probably survive off about 1.5 liters. So as long as we I think the longest we had a water supply was 2.5 days, and we had it planned, so we actually never ran out of water. Exactly, it's heavy as hell. Oh my god. But we did. That's so cool. You biked across all 50 states. You heard me,
But I didn't do it by myself.
comparisons of people joy, Linda. Any other questions?
Could you repeat your ending quote for the Zoom just like really clearly?
Absolutely. Of course, a ship is safest at port, but that is not what ships are built for.
Question about you also bike across South America.
I did also bike across South America. That was more recently. My brother and I were 4 years apart for the week. And after his cross-country bike trip, he had a dream of biking in South America and never got to do that. And so when I turned 25, which was the age that he was when he died, just a few years ago, so a few years after this trip, I decided to do that trip. I did have a real big girl job at that time, but I managed to finagle a leave of absence for myself. Didn't get paid, but I had my job held for me and rode my bike from Lima, Peru to Buenos Aires, Argentina. I swear, bike touring is really addictive. You go on one trip, you have a mouse a cookie, you wake up in the Andes wondering what happened to your old life.
How long? Sorry.
Go for it.
I was wondering how long that trip was in comparison to the other trip, like how many miles and how long it took, and also like whether it was anything typical terrain wise.
Excellent question. So this was 8,000 miles in 7.5 months, which isn't especially fast. Like if you're doing the math, it's like around 1,000 miles a month. But I was in a group, and there's this other quote that I like. It's together you go fast, or alone you go faster, together you go farther. And so when one person's knees hurt that day, you didn't go, right? Like there is no support vehicle. No one's coming for you. You wait, you write letters, you look at trees. So there were days that we could like do well over 100 miles. And if you average that, you would think 1,000 miles take you 10 days instead of a month. But aside from needing to go the speed of the slowest person, like I can crush on flats, I can do a century, no problem. I'm so slow at climbing. So I was the weakest link when we were in the Canadian Rockies. I was faster in the desert, and it sort of balanced itself out. And the other thing is just like body preservation. If you get injured, it's done. So you do need to like build in a lot of rest time for yourself. So 8,000 miles in 7.5 months. My bike trip in South America was 2,500 and 2.5 months. That was a lot more difficult because of illness. We kept getting altitude sick and kept getting food poisoning. So we think about we never felt alive until we get food poisoning avoid 5 runs. Oh, it is terrible. But that was also a really incredible adventure from a linguistic and cultural perspective. Got to be in so many new places. Yeah,
Can you talk a little bit more about like the where you can like take charge or like, I don't know, like what happened, things and stuff.
absolutely. I remember one of my friends looked at me when I was just changing a Diva cup and spitting water from my Camelback out in just in the wilderness, and she looked at me and said, "Suzette, I know you better than I wished I could ever know someone." It's really true. Love her to death. But it was, we all stuck together and everyone did the sections they intended to. So this was being balanced between time off, people had off work, between school. So there were 7 of us who rode sections of it, but they were between usually 4 of us, but then as few as 3 and as many as 6. You have to communicate a lot. It's challenging. One thing that was somewhat hard is that, so I was with my brother's girlfriend, Rachel, and a lot of people were very excited to meet us and hear our story and things like that, which was really beautiful, but could also be really emotionally exhausting. You have to basically recap the worst day of your life every single day to people who are really curious. And it's important, right? Like I went on this trip, the big part to talk to people about the importance of not using your phone when driving. And a lot of people maybe don't have a personal experience with that, but have a personal experience with loss. And so that's something that really resonate with them. So Rachel and I very much felt the importance of talking about this. But I think it was hard for the two other members of our group, Megan and Greg, who definitely did not have as much focus on them, despite doing a really amazing and really objectively hard thing. So it could be hard where we were emotionally taxed, they felt a little underappreciated, and we would have to kind of try to tap each other in. But I am so proud of us. Like, we worked really hard together, and sometimes we're tense, but these are people who I love dearly and who none of whom had all met until we met up in Alaska. Like, these are not lifelong friends. This is like a motley crew who came together to do this thing, and I'm so grateful to.
We have a question from the chat, which is how many plaques did you guys get?
Oh my gosh, I feel like this is gonna be a promotion for Schwalbe Marathon Pluses because I only got 3 flats at 8,000 miles. I've gotten more flats in the past 2 months in Ann Arbor because I'm riding thinner tires. Those things are bulletproof. These tires are so heavy, so they're useful in terms of not getting flats, and also when you're carrying already quite a bit, the value add of not having flats is pretty high because changing a flat is so much more work to unstrap all your things. So 3 flats, 8,000 miles. For me, I think everyone was ±2.
What did you say?
Schwalbe Marathon Pluses. Schwalbe. Yeah, they're great tires.
Okay.
My dad always says, you got to invest. Hey, Dad, by the way, you got to invest in what goes between you and the ground, your mattress, your shoes, and your bike tires. And so I took that to heart. 1 or 2 more questions?
Yeah, and could you make sure you repeat the question before you answer it?
Yes, I will. Thank you.
So was the road that was north of Fairbanks, is that the pipeline road that was built?
Yes,
So it looked more scenic than I expected it to be.
that, so it's,
Because I've seen routes that people have done, you know, with our RVs and stuff, and it's like, why would anyone go up there?
yes.
And
So
it's like, it looks like it's actually kind of cool.
So the question was about the route that I did between Death Horse and Fairbanks. It's called the Dalton Highway and what it looked like. That was literally the most scenic picture in all of the Dalton Highway. Like, it was, so the sun never set. So it was always just vaguely dim, but it was very gray. The only people who are on this road are professional truckers and people who are related to the oil pipeline. And this giant pipeline runs parallel to the road the whole time. While that section is only really professional truckers, otherwise in the north, the people that you see constantly are American retirees in a rented RV on their like God's mission to Alaska. So many people do this, but I wouldn't say that was a scenic part of the trip. And unless you're doing something like go hard or go home like this, I wouldn't necessarily recommend it. But parts of the Yukon and southern Alaska were really extraordinary. And most of the really beautiful photos that you saw were taken in not that far north, more in the central northern region.
Yeah, I've been in that part, so that's why I was
Oh,
surprised.
cool.
When I was 21, I hitchhiked from Fairbanks to Oregon.
Oh,
So I
we
was
love it.
really kind of in DC and stuff like that.
Well acquainted. It's still
Yeah. But I haven't
untouched
been
and
back yet.
beautiful. You gotta go back.
I know.
Any final questions?
So did you advertise the adventure cycling for people to come and join your group?
We didn't advertise it in a very big way, just because once your group gets large, it gets very logistically difficult, and especially if you're trying to camp or stay in homes, and we just got into extraordinarily good shape, and so it could be somewhat hard for someone to jump into a trip and start keeping the mileage that we were averaging. Although we did have some friends do it, they were training pretty diligently. And when we met up with people on the road, we'd often ride with them for several days. We had one amazing guy, Jeff, who we met in Texas. He's like, oh, I'll ride with you today. The next day, oh, I'll ride with you today. And then 3,000 miles later in Key West, we're still hanging out with Jeff. All to say, we didn't publicize it, but people did join us. Well, thank you all so much. for being here.
Thank you all for coming. It was so lovely to have you all here. I think this is the most we've had in person since we started having in-person meetings again, at least that I've been here. And so it's so wonderful to see you. And thank you again to Suzette for sharing your story. She did such a wonderful job.
We're going next.